So let's make a start. Massive welcome to everybody to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Jane Lewis. I'm one of the directors at the Centre for Evidence and Implementation based here in London, as I hope you'll clock from my background. And it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting this webinar today. This is the first in a series of virtual webinars leading up to the Evidence and Implementation Summit 2021. EIS is going to be the hot event of the year. It's going to take place in March. It'll be in Sydney. And we're bringing together practitioners, organizational leaders, researchers, policymakers to really drill down into where we are with implementation science and practice and how we move the field forward. We've got some absolutely brilliant keynote speakers lined up, and the call for abstracts is open. Get your abstract in by the 27th of August. I know some people will be unsure about whether they'd be able to get to Sydney or not, but don't worry about that, because we'll make sure that we can include absolutely everybody who's registered, whether you're in Sydney or wherever in the world you are. And you can find all the details about EIS on the conference website, eisummit.org, as you can see on the slide there. So this virtual series is our way of starting the conversation now leading up to EIS. And we want to use the series of webinars to identify the most important issues in implementation and science, and to start getting into them, to bring together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, to share ideas and to start making connections. And we hope that will also help people to think of ideas to put forward in abstracts. We'll tell you about the next webinar at the end of this one. We've got an absolute corker lined up. But for this first webinar, we're taking advantage of the recent launch of Implementation Science 3.0, which is an absolutely brilliant review of where we are with implementation and science as we move into the third decade of it. And we've brought together the three co-editors on the panel today. So we've got Bianca Albers, Aaron Schlonsky, and Robin Milden, and you're all three very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Many of you will know at least one, if not two or all three of them. Bianca is the chair of the European Implementation Collaboration. She has a huge amount of experience of promoting the use of evidence and really high quality implementation in child and youth and family services.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Bianca. Aaron is professor and head of the social work department at Monash University, has an international reputation for his work on child welfare and for its influence on policy and practice. Hi, Aaron, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
And Robin Milden is Executive Director of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, with a very long-standing career in supporting the implementation and mainstreaming and scaling up of evidence-informed practices to improve the well-being of people in communities affected by adversity across the world. And we've got you. We've got 500 people registered for the webinar from 30 countries and 5 continents. I think it's only Antarctica that's yet to feel the love, but we'll be reaching out. And it really is a very great pleasure to have you all here today. So thank you very much indeed. How we'll be rolling today is that we're recording the webinar and we'll put it up on the EIS website. I'll kick off with a series of questions to the panel. You'll all be muted, but you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. So please use that all the way through the webinar to raise any questions that you want to raise. We'll work them into the questions that I put to the panel, and we'll also make sure that we devote time at the end of the webinar specifically to your questions. And Vanessa Rose will be curating your questions and bringing them in. So please do start adding them through the Q&A button now. I think you'll also find a feature there where you can like other people's questions, and that will help Vanessa in highlighting, in deciding which ones to call out. And then if you do experience any tech difficulties as we go, just use the chat button and our tech support actually will get onto that. So Q&A button for questions, chat function for just specifically for tech problems. So I'm going to put the first question to you, Robin, but Aaron and Bianca, please do chip in if you want to add to what Robin says, or disagree or agree or reinforce anything that she has to say. So Robin, let's do some scene setting first of all. Can you tell us a bit about where implementation science has come from, how it's going to help policymakers and agencies achieve their goals, and why it feels like it's having a real moment just now?
Thanks, Jane. Well, a lot of people just scanning down who's signed on will know this already, but briefly, implementation science emerged really from a major concern with the speed with which research or evidence-based practice was bridging the gap between what we knew can help people, citizens of countries, and getting that implemented in practice and policy. And that people were finding, as scientific discoveries of what works to improve the well-being of people, as that sort of exploded, and we know more and more across all the different disciplines we work in, that it was just taking us a little bit long to get that into real-world settings. And the reference often quoted, which I think COVID is proving us wrong at the moment, is the 17-year gap in something like early childhood, where we know things of what works we know things that do work to help kids to grow up being as healthy and happy as they can. And it was just taking us up to about 15 to 17 years to translate that to their benefit, which if you think about in early childhood terms, that's 3 generations of kids that would be missing out on that. So it emerged really in health first, and then other sort of social sciences and social sectors have followed suit. There is an enormous amount of benefits that policy and practice can take from implementation science. And what we know, the cool thing about implementation science is it's a science. That means it's things that people are testing, trying, and sharing, as opposed to some other sort of disciplines that sometimes are more around, you know, the latest idea or fad. Implementation science, you know, the aim is to share the science and learn more and more how to effectively implement things that will benefit people. And what we mean by that is it goes from an innovation to an innovation that becomes routine practice, day-to-day practice, without it being something new all the time. So just quickly, the benefits are enormous. There's things we know from implementation science, that it's a team sport, and we have to engage with stakeholders across multiple levels, and you'll probably hear more about that today. It is that you have to attend to lots of different levels, not only individuals, but organizations and systems. It's taught us a lot about how it matters how you implement something, that is what strategies you use. For policy in particular, right now we have a natural lab going on where there's multiple countries with multiple different policy responses to the COVID situation. And we're learning a lot about what are the implementation strategies required to enable these policy decisions. A good example is education, everybody moving from in-face to online. What are the implementation strategies needed to do that effectively? So I think the rest of what we've got planned today will pick up on those things, and we'll remember to kind of reference practicing and policy, because although it is a science, it's an applied science that counts in the real world.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Robin. And I think your point about implementation science helping to speed up the movement of evidence into practice is absolutely key. It's not about creating additional challenges or barriers or burdens. It's about speeding up that process. That's really important. Thanks very much indeed. Bianca, I want to put the next question to you. If you were to give advice to somebody from practice or from policy making about how to get into the field of implementation science and how to quickly develop an understanding of the key concepts, what would you recommend them to do?
I think I would start by saying you're in for a treat. This is very exciting. Nice to see that interest. And then also say it's a perfect time to get into implementation science, because there is a body of knowledge that you can draw on now. And there are these very easy resources out there that help you get into the basics. And that can be introductory readings. So even scientists have worked hard to kind of get the essence of implementation into a simple paper that gives you the broad picture kind of view. So if anyone on this call is interested in particular reading lists or any of that kind, very happy to share some. There are podcasts out there. There are people like us and others in the world to talk to. I think anybody in the implementation science world would be very happy to share some basic insights from their experience with working in implementation. And then I find the implementation frameworks, of which there are so many, I know, but there are quite a few out there that give you, again, this broad picture view and are a good starting point for getting your head into implementation science. And in the child and family services world, it would be particularly the APIS or the active implementation frameworks, or in health, the CFR, to go to get this sense of what is it they're talking about, and what are some of the key terminologies and understandings that drive implementation science. But of course, all of this should be a bit guided by your particular interests, and they can be very different depending on whether you come from practice or from policy. So I think it's important for you to figure out, if you're interested in implementation science, so why is implementation important to you, your individual work, your organization? What do you want from it? What is it that your organization then needs? And let that be the guide also in your exploration of the field. You might want to invite somebody with expertise in implementation science to bring you up to speed. I think especially policy developers may depend more on that than on reading themselves. Let this person help you think through things and develop a bit of a roadmap or a structure for your implementation work, and then begin your first lessons, begin applying those in your own world, and then build from there. And there will be other tools. There are the more practical tools for you to use, implementation measures, or templates for implementation plans, or ready-made implementation guides that other organizations have developed, and that can help you develop an understanding of how a good implementation process would look like. And then I would build further from there. But of course, it's a bit of a journey. It's not something that you can accomplish within 2 weeks' time.
That's great. Thanks, thanks, Bianca, very much. Anything, Robin or Aaron, that either of you would like to add to that?
Just to build on a notion of trying it, I think in terms of evidence-based practice and teaching it, similarly, trying it on a small thing or with one client in one way, without worrying about doing it everywhere is I think the way to go. And a bit of kind of knowing methods enough to either use them or get others to use them well. For me, that often is a stumbling block, where there's a kind of a bunch of stuff you'd have to almost know before getting to something. And one of those is just having a general understanding of, well, how are we measuring things? How are we testing things? And without that, it's for me, it's a bit difficult to get to really critically thinking about how things are unfolding. It's not the only thing. You could know methods really well and be really not so great at implementation. But I think it's one of the core things for me.
That's great, thank you. And we'll come on to look at methods a bit more in a moment. But Robin, what for you are the really key criteria of good implementation practice? What does it really look like when it's being done well?
Well, I mean, again, Jane, the cool thing is, because it's a science, I like to, lean in on all the explosion of published studies in implementation science about what seems to predict effective implementation or what barriers seem to be people are encountered, what strategies, but there are some common things that you see in the literature. That we've got a lot to learn still. One of them, again, is this targeting of many different stakeholders, but in addition, and we get this wrong all over the place, is really thinking about how the what, the intervention, the innovation, the policy, whatever it is that you're wanting to implement, the level of fit it has in terms of what people need. So sometimes we think we kind of have the solution and we just need to get it to the population. And implementation science, the research is pretty clear that unless it does fit the need that people have in some way, you're either going to implement something that they don't need in the first place. And if you implement it really well, it means you're really not going to find much of an effect because it wasn't going to solve the problem in the first place. So that's a pretty steady finding in implementation and would indicate some level of high quality implementation practice. That is drawing on implementation science to inform your implementation practice. That is what you're doing when you're moving an innovation from a sort of an idea into the real world and improving on it. There's one. There's another few common things such as implementation does really matter. And it's the bit we sort of take for granted. So the studies are also pretty clear. If you use just one or two implementation strategies, you're not going to have a really large effect. There is a long history of research, for example, showing that training alone doesn't work very well for humans and that we have to add some other strategies. Now, in saying that, some of the implementation science also sometimes implies we have to load an enormous amount of strategies on. And that really hasn't been shown to be true. So it's this kind of using this iterative way to go, what's the least amount we can put in from an implementation strategy point of view to get the outcome? And context really matters. So the third thing is, no matter what, context is king. There always will need to be some consideration of context. People are different, places are different. And that's also showing in, again, the explosion of implementation research is that the consideration of context, whether it be organizational, systems, political, is important when you're trying to think about how to, again, get something into implementation and practice or policy and make it routine. Then, of course, there's thinking about it in stages, which all the frameworks talk about are pretty consistent. A lot of frameworks are saying that it takes a long time. We've always traditionally said that at implementation science. COVID sort of proving us wrong a little bit on a couple of things there. So it'd be worth kind of raising that in a bit more depth on in this chat. Preparation is crucial. There's this emerging science around readiness for implementation. We have a lot of colleagues that work in the area. So you can almost kind of take the chunks of what science is saying to inform our practice, but again, we have a long way to go. Bianca might want to add a couple of things. Yeah.
Not a couple of things, but I think it's implicitly in what you're saying, but I find it worth repeating again and again. It's the acknowledgement, for me, a key criteria of high quality implementation practice would be an acknowledgement that implementation is real work. Because people often buy into the frameworks and into the basic thinking of implementation science. But when they then do their implementation, they continue to put the implementation work onto everything else that people are doing. So in your preparation, to think about how do I build an infrastructure that can help me consolidate my implementation is pretty important, and probably still one of the most basic barriers that we run into in organizations. They want to work with implementation, but haven't thought of staffing it, resourcing it, and really supporting it in active ways.
Yeah. But I really like the very empowering way that you talk about implementation science, both of you, as being something that empowers practice and practitioners, and that's, that has to be sort of super reflective of the context and their strategic objectives. And, there's that lovely phrase about implementation science being a science that's in service to practice, which I think is really, really important to remember, and that it is all about speeding things up. But I mean, one of the key challenges that comes out strongly in the book is the still limited use of implementation science in policy and practice. So, you know, we're seeing this divide developing between research and practice in the implementation field, just as we've seen it in the intervention field. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about how we can work better across researchers and agencies and policy developers to change this and to really get implementation being implemented in practice? Bianca, do you want to lead us off on that one?
Yeah, and probably with a little grumpy note, because I think in my head, I am not hopeful that either of these three, so you say we have three legs, we have a research leg, a practice leg, and a policy leg. I don't think that any of these three will really take the task and make sure that we move this research evidence around to get it used in policy and practice. It's just, and it's not because they don't want to, but just the conditions they operate under, what's important to researchers at the end, it's publishing articles, what's important for practice, it's helping people, what's important for policy developers, it's kind of distributing resources and making big decisions. I don't think there's any incentive for them to use research and really actively push it into their work. And that's why I tend to believe that brokerage, so really working with roles, organizations that can fill the space between these three legs and be the transmitter, is pretty important. And they then have a bit of a monumental task because they need to make sure that they are relevant. So when they work with one of these systems, they kind of need to make sure that the systems understand why it's important that evidence gets into whatever it is, practice or policy. And this relevance is not easily established. They need to be competent. They need to know the sector they work in, the practice they're working with, the particular discipline they represent. They need to know implementation. So I think they need to be specialists in their own way. They need to time their efforts very well. So when there is an option, an opportunity to work with a policy developer, for example, on something that is to be infused with evidence, jump through that time window when it opens for you. They need to be good at working with leaders, the decision makers in the process that really can help push the envelope of evidence agenda setting forward. And they depend on capacities themselves. So being a single broker in a huge health system is probably too big of a task. So how do you build that brokerage capacity over time? Of course, there are these intermediary organizations that can play a role in this context, but I don't think they can cover everything. There are studies of internal facilitation or internal consultants. How can we develop them into strong brokers that over time establishes this layer of bridge builders that can move evidence back and forth between research, practice, and policy? That would be my immediate take on this question, I think.
That idea of bridge builders, I think, is a lovely one and a really important one. But Aaron, I mean, you also make the point in the book that implementation is or certainly should be a really transdisciplinary science, and that there's scope to strengthen the connections between between implementation science and other sciences. What do you see as the real priorities in that, and what's it going to take to move forward and to make it happen?
Well, for transdisciplinary stuff, I think the world is moving in that direction. At the same time, we're specializing into smaller and smaller expertise, and we have the need to build together these things where you can't have expertise across everything, and one of the areas that I think is crucial is thinking about, this panel won't be surprised about it, but thinking about data in a very different way and its usefulness in telling us whether we're implementing, how we're implementing, how policies shift, whether or not something is implemented, whether or not you can even hope to achieve an implementation in a given context. And these are all things that are difficult to do prospectively. We all talk about them a lot. Hey, we've got to do preparation for implementation. Here are the things we need to do. What's the context like, et cetera, and then we go and we talk to a bunch of people and they give us their opinion about what it is, what's happening with the agency and the policy. And often we discover barriers and we can deal with them ahead of time. But a heck of a lot of the time, we retrospectively discover what those barriers are. The decision's already been made to implement this thing, and going forward, that's what's going to happen. The policy has been put in place. And while I think that's a really big implementation challenge, we often don't think about, well, how do we use the extant data that is collected by an agency for the purposes of seeing whether or not we can discover what might work or what might need to be done to make it work, to get different policies in place. So to that end, there's a lot that computer science IT can do for us in terms of taking a whole gob of data and using machine learning, natural language processing, et cetera, even for qualitative data that are in there, to have us get a sense of the noise around each of the key decision points that an agency has to make with, let's say, clients, or health professionals have to make with patients, or what have you. And not relying on 3 focus groups with 4 people who always show up at the last, at every focus group, and figuring out that, okay, this is what we need to do. These are the barriers we're going to have. But that's complicated, and getting those type of data requires huge partnerships across IT, statistics, and even linguistics, to try to figure out whether or not we can use these data. So I think that's a big one. And for me also, it's just taking the role of the university in all of this a little bit more seriously. And CEI does this a lot, but thinking about not just one person, your connection to a university, not just one person, but possibly a range of people. So if we can get a beachhead going where there's funded research and or articles, et cetera, that lead to benefits to obviously clients, et cetera, but also to each of the players, then all of a sudden we've got a world-class economist that can go on a project. We've got a world-class data mining person or AI specialist, or et cetera, along with that.
Could I add to that?
Together.
Could I add to that, Aaron? Because especially the current situation, I think in order to understand what works in implementation, what not in relation to COVID-19, how do you want to understand that entire scenario without involving anthropologists, economists, political scientists? So for me, that is just such a classic example that we can't continue working in these monodisciplinary kind of settings, but really need to continuously build broader research teams, and for that sake also broader implementation practice teams, where different types of expertise is brought to the table and really integrated into the approach you're taking.
And as you say, that now is absolutely the moment for that. So let's look at COVID and implementation science a bit now. So Bianca, since you've got the mic, how's implementation going to help the world to deal with COVID-19, and what's COVID-19 teaching us about implementation science?
All right, so this is a big one, and I by no means am a COVID expert, but just coming to this from an implementation science perspective, I would think there are kind of 2 scenarios. We have something to bring to COVID, the pandemic, But as Robin highlighted in the beginning of this call, COVID teaches us a lot at the same time. So let me talk briefly about these two scenarios. So for scenario one, we bring something to COVID and teach the COVID people something. I think we need an implementation science approach now more than ever. It's a pandemic, it's here to stay. We need to expect new waves, and societies across the globe need to be ready for continuously turning on different kinds of knobs. And these knobs are the evidence-based interventions or research-supported interventions that we all are so familiar with by now. So social distancing, hand washing, testing, contact tracing, isolation, quarantine. And what implementation science has to bring, and together with behavioral science, improvement science, is help to understand how to turn these knobs, how to develop implementation strategies that can help to implement these interventions, and be it through policy development, education of the public, selection of particular technologies. There are so many ways to do it. So implementation tells something about what types of strategies are out there, and help people start thinking about the doing of implementing these interventions. The implementation science brings insights on what to be aware of when you're doing your implementation. We've talked about readiness on this call, and we know South Korea, with their previous experience with pandemics or epidemics, was in a much better position than the UK, where no such experience was present. So that says something about the readiness of an entire nation. But readiness is also helpful to figure out what is needed if I want to do active social distancing and maintain it in our local community. How does my kindergarten look like if I want to enable social distancing? I think that's where implementation science has something to offer, to think through difficult problems. In similar ways, we know something about how culture influences implementation processes. What is possible in South Korea, something like a contract tracing app, is, I wouldn't say impossible, but much more tricky to land in the country that I'm living in, Germany, where privacy, data security concerns are much higher on the list of things to think through when you implement a contact tracing app. Implementation science also brings awareness of certain implementation outcomes. What do you want to achieve through your implementation? So at the moment, I think appropriateness of interventions, acceptability of interventions at a society level, social distancing and the like, is very high on the agenda. So maybe you want to work with these implementation outcomes, but at the same time, feasibility, how easy is it to implement a particular intervention, or the costs is equally important to consider. So these are the things that implementation science helps to think about in the current context.
That's great. And again, you really emphasise, Robin did right at the beginning, the importance of really richly understanding the social context that you're operating in. And Robin, one of the things that COVID-19 has done has been to really shine a spotlight on the structural inequality that exists in many or all of our societies. So can we talk a bit about how implementation science can actually help us to deal with inequality? What does implementation science bring in terms of how it approaches equity and the promise that it holds there?
I was petrified you were going to ask me this, because I'm not sure it's going to in its current form, because it's very reliant on the resources of a country, right? So, because I was having a little think about it, and there's a question in the chat I actually want to bring up. So I have the chat screen up here, and there's an awesome point somebody's made I just want to address. Because all people deserve to get what they need, whether it was in COVID or whether it wasn't. And therefore, again, to kind of bridge that gap, we're thinking about what needs to happen to have some behavior change and maintain that and sustain it, to get the infrastructure in place to get, you know, masks out, to and where you see implementation possibly working quite well, there's not a lot of commentary going on. There's a little bit of concern around, you know, lower resource countries and their ability to get implementation infrastructure and to put some of these public health measures in place, but we haven't really studied it. And there's some amazing work by colleagues in the US that have shown with kind of light touch implementation strategies, we can help interventions that are effective in supporting people's trauma after torture. That can get implemented in place sustainably in a low resource setting, but we haven't paid enough attention to it. And you know, is it possibly the situation that we're creating inequality in the implementation of these public health initiatives because it's based on the infrastructure of the country you just happen to live in, a country's ability to survive? So Australia, where we're sitting right now, I mean, you can't get in and out. So our implementation strategy right now is we shut down. Like, I can go out now to a restaurant and we're still to continue implementing certain behavior change things, which is going to be interesting how that's going to go. But in the end, the leadership and the financial infrastructure to maintain our economy at some level in a shutdown is quite unique to a country that traditionally has been quite well off. So I worry a little bit that implementation science hasn't, other than the work of people like Shannon Dorsey in the US, and it hasn't kind of helped bridge the gap of in that everybody deserves to get the things that they need to help them. And how do we do that in various countries that aren't necessarily, you know, well-resourced European countries, or even the UK to a certain extent, Jane. So, but there's somebody's put a question up. I just want to, because it's a cracker, and it, like, all your questions are amazing, by the way, everyone. All of you, you're amazing. But I wanted to do something because it actually made me think while Bianca and Aaron were talking, and that has got nothing to do with what you two were saying. But somebody's put up a question. If implementation science is being utilized, is that a sign it doesn't meet the needs of the knowledge users in its current form? That is like,
I love it.
Yes. Yes. And
it's
in
yeah,
fact,
it's totally
some
ironic.
of our answers are not helping with that. So even some of the ways you're kind of thinking about how you're communicating something. So what's the core? So I would 100%, most people that we're trying to influence to consider implementation science and policy and practice implementations, to consider investing in implementation science, that is probably invest in more than traditionally what is just training. It's a very delicate communications job because it sounds overwhelming. Like it sounds like you're going to take forever. You're going to do all these stages. It's going to be a million strategies. Who's going to pay for it? And then everyone's like, stop listening, and they've gone back to do the thing they were doing before because it's easier. And although there are amazing articles in implementation science, these journals coming up out of everywhere, but the new one around communication implementation science, I think, is a cool one, because we have to get really, really good at communicating this. And if it sort of sticks in its traditional wheelhouse of writing papers for papers, and so I think that's part of the problem, the person that posted that, for sure. And it's just,
and I would say it's where this brokerage comes in again. So even though there is a lot of implementation science, I still think you need people who have a bit of a leg in all camps and know what can be drawn upon and put over into the practice or the policy field. I
reckon possibly not in every setting. So Maureen Dobbins, that her work in Canada has always influenced that. So when she did the studies of a knowledge broker in a health setting, and where this is folks, an idea of testing whether an implementation strategy works, right? So when you're talking about that, Bianca, I was thinking, yeah, okay, so she showed in her work, and this was a while back she did this, but there's still papers that are well worth looking, where a good knowledge broker, that someone knew how to bridge the gap between research and practice in a health setting, they were seen to be very effective at getting evidence implemented in that health setting where the setting was quite chaotic. But where the setting was quite organized, very evidence-friendly, sort of good systems in place, the knowledge broker appeared to make little difference as an implementation strategy. And again, that's the cool thing about implementation science, because you're kind of picking off what you want to do and then testing whether that's going to work. Because it may be an unnecessary resource, although it might go back to the equity question that, Jane, you asked me, where maybe that's a way to improve equity, where you're putting your knowledge broking resource that Bianca was suggesting into certain settings, which goes back to context is king, which another person's asked about that, which we don't have time, but yes.
And context is king. In the net, there's another question up there that's really nice about assuming that everybody's going to be a rational actor and we're all going to do this because it makes sense. And one of the key aspects of leadership that's really squishy, of implementation that's really squishy is leadership. I remember Bianca did a literature review at some point where looked at every kind of leadership book that has ever been written and what's the evidence actually behind what they're saying. And turns out to be quite thin. And that's kind of playing out across all of these different countries as well. Not to mention any names, I probably don't have to, but when people say crazy stuff and abdicate their leadership and aren't honest, transparent, and really reliable leaders and users of evidence, et cetera, a lot of craziness starts to come up. And it's very difficult to have any kind of implementation occur with leadership that people who are doing the implementation don't trust. And I think COVID has entirely fleshed this out, which is horrifying to observe, but it's something to learn.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let's go to the questions that folks have been raising then, because there are some absolute corkers in there. One I wanted to call out was whether there are preconditions that need to be in place for implementation to work. I mean, what needs to be there already for implementation science to be an effective approach and to be able to sort of get traction and to grow. Bianca, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so just immediately, I would say not necessarily. It depends on the resources that you have, of course. But let's say you have a context in which evidence is a total stranger. It's never been tried out before. A context where the structure is quite chaotic. There's a scarcity of resources and a lot of pressure from an external environment. That sounds like a bad starting point for doing an ambitious implementation project. Unless you have somebody, a resource that comes in or is there who can really totally control it. But of course, it would remain a pretty vulnerable setup for doing an implementation in that context. So, and that's where this readiness idea comes in. Again, an idea that needs much more examination, but I think just basic readiness in terms of, do you have leadership in the context you're working in? Is there just a basic agreement on that this implementation is a good idea? Are there some resources to direct towards the implementation, no matter if they are new or repurposed within the system you're working in? So I would use these types of indicators as a thermometer to understand, is the temperature right for implementation, and then start from there. So my position would be there needs to be a basic infrastructure that a context that wants to do implementation can build on.
So the demand is the key thing. There's a couple of lovely questions here about implementation strategies. Robin, do you want to take these? So the first one is, which strategies are effective and in which context, and is there a nice summary?
That's hilarious. Thank you.
And the second is, if training alone doesn't work for humans, what other strategies should we be thinking about?
I mean, so the first question, the second question is easier than the first, and that is, there's a lot of really good literature, and good colleagues of ours have been writing about this for a while, that talks about kind of training plus strategies. So it might be, I mean, the famous quote everybody used for a long time was studies from the 1980s in education showing how effective adding some in-classroom coaching for teachers after some training to help them implement the new teaching strategies they're going to use, how effective that was in improving the fidelity of their implementation. You see that a lot in the child and family stuff. I was trained originally as a psychologist. We were taught to, training and coaching was an automatic way that we were taught to implement things. So there's other strategies like the use of data. So, and again, it's a bit dependent on the context, but often we would say you're going to need a training plus strategy, and some of that's going to be helping people use the strategies in place. And technology will help us with that. You know, it's been pretty amazing also how people have been able to do that, continue to do that without everything having to be face to face. The first part of that, there's no. There, I wish, so again, a good colleague of all of ours who's getting famous because he did one of the hardest PhDs that you could ever do, where someone made a map, every single implementation strategy ever written about, ever, then made him come up with some consensus about what it was going to be called, and then a consensus on the definition. Oh my gosh, poor guy, Byron Powell, apologies. And so there's been some sort of movement, particularly coming out of the US, that is kind of affecting other countries to kind of be a little bit more consistent with what we call these implementation strategies and what they are, and then start to test them. But I mean, again, colleagues that have been doing implementation work in low resource setting have seen the same findings, where there needs to be a training plus. Obviously, there needs to be some resource, there needs to be some data. But no, we are a long way off being able to answer that. And whether or not we'll ever be able to answer it like this works here for these people, this works here, because it's so dependent on what you're trying to implement. Is it a policy, is it a practice? It's so dependent on, there's not sometimes a lot of evidence for what the problems we're trying to solve, particularly in the sort of work we do at CEI. The evidence base is not as strong as we'd like it. So we are needing to draw on implementation science to do some best bets and some rapid kind of evaluation to see how quickly. But I mean, it's a good area to get into, and it really lends itself to very nice, quick, rapid evaluation methods to kind of try and test. Yeah.
I would probably add just, and this of course is a bit of a cursory reading in my brain right now, but I don't think there are very many studies that say that leadership does not play a role in implementation. I think most studies would say when we had the support, the active support from our leadership, implementation went better. So I would always let that blink a little bit on your radar when you do implementation as a separate strategy.
Yeah, I think it comes across really strongly in the chapter in the book on implementation strategies as well, that point about the need for them to fit really, really well with the context. And of course, the people who know the context best are the people who are in the context. And it's a point that comes out strongly in the chapter, that co-design of implementation strategies, really working with the people who are living and breathing in the context where you're going to be implementing, is absolutely essential to sort of work out what sorts of strategies might be needed and might not. For me, this is an area where we need to do far more research, where we're actively comparing the effect of different types of implementation strategies at addressing the same implementation challenge, or we're looking at varying the dosage or the sequencing or the combination, and really trying to understand, as one of you, I think Robin said earlier, what's the minimum amount of implementation support that needs to be provided? How can we design implementation strategies that really fit for a real world context and that are doable at scale, rather than a kind of kitchen sink, let's chuck absolutely everything in type approach. We've got time for a couple more questions. Aaron, there have been several questions here about the connection between research translation and implementation science, and the fact that the terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And there's quite a lot of crossover between them. Can you just shed a bit of light on those definitional issues?
Well, yeah, the other two folks here are going to have to help me on this one. there's a lot of overlap between these terms and the term knowledge mobilization as well. So implementation science from implementation from the kind of way back here is not just about taking evidence and translating it into something you could do. I would see implementation as a broader piece that encompasses that, but also says, and let me help you do that. Or here are the strategies that we can put together to actively get you through a process of figuring out what the evidence is and utilizing it, and even extending beyond that, kind of taking us through being really specific about the population we're looking at, what we're trying to achieve with that, and how we're going to know we've gotten there, and all the strategies that go into knowledge, like managing that particular piece. Maybe it should be implementation management that we're talking about. That's not kind of, to me, in that translation piece. So I'd be curious to hear what Robin and Bianca have to say about that, though.
I mean, my only comment, I just think we've made things difficult again with terms. There's a comment here also I spotted around operational research, and then bang, implementation science showed up. And yeah, I only just recently discovered what operational research was, the person that's posted that. I'd never heard of it till a little while ago. So to me, operational research kind of, but they're related, you know, if you put the two against each other. But I think it's really tricky, because when we start to kind of, again, it's been a problem of the speed of the science and how much it's escalated, because like anything, you know, someone writes about knowledge mobilization here, someone writes about research translation here, someone writes about knowledge translation here. The implementation science folk would say, well, we're more active in our implementation. We're about getting that done in place, whereas translation implies a more passive strategy, and passive strategies haven't shown to work very well. So straight dissemination isn't the most effective. So I think it's unhelpful sometimes to go around and round on the terms, but probably making it really hard for people when they're entering into the field. You know, quality improvement's another one. I don't know, Bianca, it's,
yeah, I would agree. And I would, just on a practical note, I would recommend people to be across the terms. If they look for particular literature, for example, try to also dive into the other terms and don't just stick with implementation science, because you will realize that even though people use the term knowledge translation, when you then see the definition, that's very much like implementation science, isn't it? And you can, I think it's also an expression of, there are some silos within the field around particular research groups that at some point of time bought into the knowledge translation term, and then they kind of stuck with it for a long time and work in their silo, and we're over here, we're working in our own silo. So there's also within the field of implementation science and co-terminology and a need to have much more integration and look at each other's work and see where it fits and how it can be merged more.
Yeah. There's a great question here about scaling up. Scaling up is the bit of implementation science and practice that I love the most, because it always seems to me to be where the real world context is absolutely there. You know, we're outside the framing of research context. This is really where the rubber hits the road. And there's a good question here about, how do you align implementation strategies if your aim is to scale up an innovation to national level? What are the key considerations and things that you need to think about, Robin, when you're looking at scaling up an innovation?
Be good to see a couple of really good studies of scaling up working. That would be phenomenal for the science. So, you know, shout out to anybody who wants to tackle that. We've been trying for a while in Australia, but it's complicated with our various levels of government. I mean, the one quick comment I'd say, I'm just aware of the time, is this is multi-level. So you're going to be, when you're talking about scaling, you're talking about, you know, whether you're going out, that is kind of wider, or up to more levels of people, but you're talking about going dealing with individuals, humans. You're also talking about dealing with some sort of organization, likely, or some sort of community. It could be, so it doesn't need to be kind of institutions in that way. It can be a community. If you think of the place-based work in Australia, some sort of community. And then you're also going to be talking about the system, which has politics, which has current funding trends, which has leadership. You'll need to think, well, I think one of the things that we need to think about is the strategies for each of those kind of nested levels, if you like, of a system will need different strategies. So it's kind of trying to think about, you know, so what would be the strategies for the individual kind of change we need to do? They're nested in a context of a community or an organization. So what would be the things that we'd need to, or we can kind of influence to achieve implementation? And then what are the politics? And we often don't do that. So we often, again, we focus very much on the individuals that have to do something different and do very little in terms of the cascade around and behind them about what needs to change. And in Australia, again, we've got example after example after example of particularly the system deciding to do something else, which just unravels any implementation effort pretty quickly. And then we're on to the next thing. So, you know, as I say, a lot of times what would be innovative is sticking with something for long enough to see if it works, to learn how to make it work, and to make it sustainable. That would be like an amazing outcome. That would also be super fun.
And so would not sticking with things that don't appear to work.
Yeah, that would also be innovative. What about that?
That would definitely free up a bit of time and headspace. There's a lovely question here, Robin. Can I just flag it really quickly, just for a really, really short answer before we move to close? That papers often talk about the need for full implementation, and this person's wondering whether that becomes an unachievable goal, and we need to think about some other kind of goal when it comes to scaling up in real world context. Do we need to be more flexible? Do we need to think in a more real world way about what we mean by implementation? Does it have to be full 100% implementation?
Yeah, I think I agree with the person that I don't think it's ever really going to be possible. And it depends what they mean by full implementation. I mean, does it mean like every single person you intend to benefit gets it? Well, I doubt that's going to happen. That hasn't happened ever. Does it mean, you know, even think of vaccination in Australia, which has a pretty good rate. We're only around mid to high 90s, I think. Does it mean 100% of the systems that need to do it? So it, does it mean that kind of classic, everyone's implementing the same way? So it depends, but I don't think there's I don't think anyone would expect full. And I mean, they could talk about, I don't know, Bianca or Aaron, if you've got something to add, but I just don't see it's realistic.
Yeah, I think some people have tried to define full implementation by saying, okay, if you have 60% of the people who potentially could use or receive an intervention, then you have reached that goal. And in that sense, it's also very kind of policy dependent kind of criteria. And I haven't been part of many systems who have reached even, I don't know, mid-level implementation.
Although in health there would be, like vaccinations, you know, there's good examples of that getting at close to full in a lot of countries. So it can happen. It's just,
yeah, that's a really good pragmatic note, I think, for us to end on. Let's be real.
Sorry, just wanted to interrupt 1 second and just make sure that we thank our contributors to the book. The book is only as good as its contributors, really.
All those people that wrote those chapters. Yeah.
my two colleagues here who did an amazing job. So I just really want to throw that out there, and I didn't mean to interrupt our closing there, but thought that would be important.
No, that's really important. It's an absolute rip-roaring good read. Okay, folks, that's really all we have time for. So a massive thank you to Robin, Aaron, and Bianca. Thank you to Vanessa for doing such a good job of curating the questions. Massive thank you to all of you for your brilliant questions. I hope that's got everybody really excited about EIS. Go to the website, submit your abstracts. You'll see all the information about the themes and the funky formats that we'll be working to there. And then just very quickly, finally, to flag our next webinar on the 17th of June, we're delighted to have Jeffrey Curran in conversation, looking at how we can speed up getting implementation into practice, getting evidence into practice, and the kinds of designs that we need to do that. He's an absolutely brilliant speaker about research design.
For those of you that know him, we call him Mr. Hybrid Design, so that'll give you
Mr.
all that flavor. Yeah.
And he will make it very, very practical and very
I'm going to interview him to make it practical. I'm not leaving that guy alone to present, so I can guarantee to you it will be something to watch. So
sign up now, register now on the eisummit.org website. So that's all we have time for. We'll put the recording of this webinar up there as well. See you on June the 17th with Jeffrey Curran, and see you in Sydney over the ether or there in the real world in March 2021. Massive thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question.
Thanks.